The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. Thank you for tuning in today. We have someone today that I think you're going to love. This man will go down in history as one of the great masters of landscape painting. His name is Thomas Kegler. He wanted to master waterfalls, but not just any waterfalls. He wanted to master Niagara Falls. So he spent weeks and weeks tromping through the woods, doing sketches, doing a lot of studies, and he really wanted to understand how water moves and how light hits the water. He did this amazing panoramic giant waterfall painting that's now in a museum for history. And he's going to show you pieces of how he did that painting today. Painting Niagara with Thomas Kegler. Enjoy.
Niagara Falls, one of the great natural wonders of the world, is considered by many to be the most well-known and beautiful waterfall on the planet. Niagara is the largest waterfall by volume in North America. Enough water flows over the falls to fill over 1 million bathtubs a minute. The Niagara River is split above the falls by Goat Island, forming 3 distinct waterfalls. The American Falls, which is flanked by the smaller Bridal Veil Falls, and the Canadian or Horseshoe Falls. The Niagara watershed is a sensitive ecosystem containing a rich biodiversity of numerous species of flora and fauna. Not only has the area long been a source of inspiration for explorers, travelers, authors, and filmmakers, it has also been a draw for painters since the 1800s. Many artists of the Hudson River School, such as Frederick Church, Thomas Cole, and Albert Bierstadt, made the pilgrimage to the falls, were enthralled by its grandeur, and captured its beauty in paint.
Art transcends for both the artist and the viewer. It elevates the human experience beyond our senses into the ethereal and the sublime, based on spiritual truths and beauty. If the artist is lucky, he or she may experience this while making their art. The viewer may find themselves drawn into a work of art and experience an extreme state of emotion, from pure joy and peace to being moved to tears. They are invited to engage and absorb this feeling. It is said that we should be in this world, not of this world. Art can serve as a bridge and a connection in this endeavor. Great art should speak to us on a spiritual level, even though it is in a very tangible and plausible visual language. It affects us in ways that are often hard to articulate, inviting us into a state of repose. As an artist, every painting you do will give you something back. In this case, painting Niagara was a very fulfilling and gratifying experience. Not only did I learn a lot technically about painting certain phenomena that are at the falls, but I walked away with a powerful emotional response and an opportunity to share and express this very sublime place. Immersing myself in nature and sharing these experiences through my paintings makes me feel more alive and appreciate life on a much higher level, and ultimately makes me feel much closer to our Creator. When I decided that Niagara Falls was going to be the subject of this large painting, I went there and visited, and immediately it resonated with my soul, and I started embarking on studies, doing drawings, field paintings, as well as taking detailed notes, so I really understood every little aspect that I needed to paint. In essence, I really got to know the anatomy of the landscape, and this gave me the visual language that I needed in order to embark on this very large painting. In many ways, this painting is about water, and I knew I needed to understand every aspect of water in order to portray it and paint convincingly and with confidence. I needed to understand how the water flowed at the top of the falls, how it dropped over the lip and cascaded down the front, crashing at the bottom, rising hundreds of feet up into the air as mist, and then flowing through the bottom in a meandering fashion so that I could explore that in my composition. What impressed me most during my visits to Niagara was the sheer power of the water. When you're standing there, you can literally feel the earth resonating below your feet from the sheets of water crashing at the bottom. It's very powerful and emotional. The smells of the ions in the air and witnessing that mist rise hundreds of feet into the air is really something that's hard to express verbally. And ultimately, I think it's one of the biggest challenges is how to capture that awe and emotion through paint. The other thing that really impressed me during my visits to Niagara was this beautiful light that happens early in the morning. It creates a clear distinction between the light and the shadow, and it casts a line going from the upper American side down to the lower Canadian, enveloping it in a beautiful light that's very much like stage lighting that the artist can bring into the painting. The rainbow is a natural phenomenon, and if the sun is out, you will likely see it at the falls. The circumstances have to be just right. You need to have a clear sun behind you, you need to have either rising or falling mist in front of you, and you need to be facing the mist. In my painting, I decided to include the rainbow to literally crown the falls, and it brought in a spiritual element which was really important for me to include in the composition. In many ways, it unified the concept. I'm excited to share with you this behind-the-scenes look into the creation of my largest and most challenging painting to date. The materials that I use in the studio are always chosen for their archival quality. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the surface. I use a double lead primed Belgian linen with a portrait weave. This has a very fine texture to it, which allows me to do very nice detail work with not a lot of the distracting textures that some of the heavier weaved linens may have. The linen is adhered to a piece of aluminum composite material. This is made with 2 thin sheets of aluminum on either side with a polyethylene core. The linen is adhered to the aluminum composite material using a piece of BIVA heat transfer adhesive. The adhesive comes with a piece of plastic on one side and a piece of coated paper on the other. These are removed during the heating process. The linen, the sheet adhesive, and the aluminum panel are all placed into a heat press and heated to about 150 degrees for 5 minutes. The reason that I decided to adhere the linen to the panel is because it's a very stable surface. Stretched canvas fluctuates with humidity and temperature. Over time, this results in cracking. Museums and contemporary artists alike are seeing the value in painting on a very stable surface, such as the aluminum composite material. The main goal here is to create a work of art that will last as long as possible. I'm always thinking about safety precautions when working in the studio. From the air that I'm breathing to the pigments I'm using, I try to take the precautions to prevent myself from being exposed to potentially toxic materials. I use a high-quality air filter along with keeping my windows open when at all possible, especially when using any kind of solvent. When working with pigments, I'm always wearing gloves in the studio. I personally prefer a pair of gardener's gloves that you get at the hardware store. They have a nice textured rubber surface so you can grab your brushes, and they have a mesh back which prevents your hands from overheating. I always find that when I wear latex gloves, my hands would overheat and sweat. This is a much more comfortable alternative, and I'm so used to wearing them, I don't even realize that I have them on my hands when working now. I'm always using paper towels in the studio. I personally prefer the blue shop towels that you get at the hardware store. They're very tough, they have good absorbency, and they don't leave a lot of lint when rubbed on the paint surface. For mixing my paint, I use a pad of gray disposable palette paper. I really like working on the surface because the neutral ground allows me to mix the mixtures and assess the colors much easier than if it was on white paper or even a brown piece of wood. And when I'm finished at the end of the day, I simply take off the page and I can dispose of it. In addition to that, I can also place this in a sealable container and place it in the freezer in between paint sessions. The pigments that I use in the studio are always chosen for 3 reasons. The first is that they have a very high quality pigment mixed in with the linseed oil. The second is that they have a very low filler content to pigment ratio. And the third is that the pigment is light fast. I need to know that these paints are not going to fade over time. I use a large variety of brands. This is a small sampling. I have Winsor Newton, Gamblin, Harding, Old Holland, and Rublev from Natural Pigments. During the painting process, I organize my pigments on a paint rack. This allows me to organize my colors in a spectral order, and as I need more pigment, I simply squeeze it out. When the paint dries, I take a chisel and I scrape off the dried paint. At the end of the day, I simply take the rack and place it into a plastic container. I also put a couple of drops of clove oil on a rag in the container so that the fumes can help slow down the oxidation of the paint. I then seal the container and place it into a freezer. Between the clove oil and the cold temperature, I can often extend the drying time of paint for up to 2 weeks. Painting mediums are added to oil paint to adjust the fluidity or viscosity of the paint. Every artist has their own favorite medium, and over the years I've tried many different brands and I've even mixed my own. The first painting medium I'd like to talk about is mineral spirits. Typically this is used for cleaning your brushes, but I also use it in the first couple of layers of the painting to lay in a wash or to block in the values. The rest of the mediums are linseed oil based. Currently my favorite painting medium is oleogel by Natural Pigments. For me, the oleogel provides the most versatile paint consistency, and I find that I use it in virtually every passage of the paint. It doesn't get sticky during the painting process, and it dries to a nice tough film. I also use the Natural Pigments epoxide oil. This can be used by itself. It's a little bit stiffer than the oleogel, but more often than not, I mix the two together to get a nice in-between consistency. Occasionally, I may want an area of the painting to be applied thick or impasto. If this is the case, I usually use the impasto medium by Rublev or Natural Pigments. I especially like to use the thicker paint in the light passages of a painting. For instance, if I was painting a still life, I might put it on the highlight on the bottle or on the petals of a flower. In the case of Niagara, I used the thick impasto paint, especially in the rapids of the water, as well as where it cascades and goes over the lip of the falls. This provides a really nice body to the paint, and it dries, holding on to and retaining the brush marks and holding its form. The one thing I want to mention and emphasize is that when you are building the layers of a painting, it's very important that you keep in mind the rule of fat over lean. What this means is that the underlying painting layers are thinned out with a little bit of mineral spirits. This means the paint is lean because there's not a lot of oil content in it. As you progressively build the layers of paint, you want each layer to have more fat content, or oil. The reason for this fat over lean rule is that you want the upper layers to dry slower than the lower layers. If you apply thin or lean paint on top of fat paint, what's essentially going to happen is that the lower layers are going to take longer to dry, and the top layer will dry faster, resulting in cracking. The final step in the construction of an oil painting is a top coat of varnish. This will protect your painting from pollutants, as well as provide a barrier from UV light rays that could fade your painting over time. What I look for in choosing a varnish is a product that is easy to remove, and it also states that it has very good UV light protection. In addition to protecting your painting, a top coat of varnish will also resaturate your colors that may have sunken in or oiled out, and it will add to the luminous quality of the oil paint. And artist brushes are perhaps the most personal tool in the studio. Here's a small sampling of some of the brushes that I use. As you can see, I have a variety of brushes that have various fibers on the ends, from natural to synthetic. I also have brushes that run the gamut from very soft to very stiff. Generally speaking, the choice between a soft or a stiff brush is determined by the consistency of the paint. If you're going to be using a stiff paint, then typically you would use a stiff brush because it allows the paint to come off of the brush easily. While if you're using a very fluid paint, you would want a soft brush because it allows the paint to flow off easier. If you try to use fluid paint with a stiff brush, you'll find it actually wipes the paint off like a trowel. And if you try to use stiff paint with a soft brush, you'll find it's actually very hard to get the paint to release from the soft bristles. In regards to the shape of the brush, each one makes a very different mark. I have flat brushes in a variety of sizes. These give me a nice broad line as I'm applying the paint, but I can also turn it on its side and apply the paint in a more linear fashion. A bright is essentially a short flat that's a little thicker when turned to profile. I use this a lot to scrub in areas. A filbert brush has aspects of a round in that it's curved on the end, but when it's turned on its profile, it's like a flat brush. This is perhaps the most versatile brush and most used in my selection. The round brush, as the name implies, has a circular ferrule that holds the fibers in a round fashion. This is a very good brush for describing details. I also have a selection of specialty brushes, such as this small rigger brush. This has a very broad base with long center fibers, and this is wonderful for doing small detail work, such as the intricacies of the branches of trees, or even my signature. This is a rubber-tipped shaper brush. I use this to often sculpt wet paint on the surface, as well as to scratch into wet glazes to reveal an underpainting. This is referred to as graffito. An artist's palette knife is used for a variety of purposes, from pre-mixing the paint on the palette, to applying paint on the surface of the painting to mimic textures, as well as for scratching off unwanted areas. The palette knife I prefer is a low Cornell J11. An artist should always invest in high quality materials and tools for the studio. The actual acts of painting will be much easier and pleasurable, and in the end, your paintings will stand the test of time. My color palette consists of a very expanded pigment selection. I have far more colors than I actually need for most paintings. But I do have a good selection in case I need to adjust the color or temperature variations within a painting. I will take a moment to explain each of the pigments that I have in the paint tray. Lead flake white is a semi-opaque white that is very ropey in its consistency and is very sculptural. Van Dyke brown is a warm black, like tar asphalt, yet not very chromatic. When mixed with white, Van Dyke brown achieves a nice neutral gray. Ivory black is a cool black. This is especially obvious when mixed with white, as the result is cool grays. Violet hematite is an opaque, earthy, reddish purple. It is cooler than manganese violet. Manganese violet is a red purple. Ultramarine violet is a blue purple. Prussian blue is a translucent deep black blue with high tinting strength. You'll see that it leans towards a greenish blue when mixed with white. Ultramarine blue is an intense cool blue. Lazurite is a beautiful deep cool blue. It's made from precious lapis lazuli stone. You can achieve beautiful soft blues when mixed with white. Turquoise blue deep is an intense medium value blue-green. I chose this color specifically for Niagara because I thought it would be useful in the transparent chromatic water passages at the lip of the falls. Nicosia green is a transparent deep green with yellow undertones. Antica green earth is a transparent olive green with warm undertones. Verona green is a transparent deep green with blue overtones. Italian green umber is an opaque, neutral, deep, dark green. This is very useful in shadows. Cadmium orange is an opaque, strong orange. Cadmium yellow medium is an opaque, strong, slightly warm yellow. Lead tin yellow is a semi-opaque, soft lemon yellow. Yellow ochre is a golden, earthy yellow. Cyprus raw umber dark is a deep, dark, semi-transparent, warm brown. Italian raw sienna is a semi-transparent, soft, reddish brown. French raw umber is a transparent, deep, soft, slightly greenish brown. Cyprus burnt umber warm is an opaque, dark, warm brown. French sienna is a transparent, soft, earthy brown. French burnt sienna is a semi-transparent, hot, reddish brown. Orange molybdate is a brilliant red orange. Red lead is an intense orange red. Venetian red is a deep red earth with pink undertones. Alizarin permanent is a transparent, dark, cool red. Cadmium red medium is an opaque, intense, chromatic warm red. Transparent red oxide is a transparent, strong, earthy red-brown. I began the Niagara painting with close to 30 pigments on my paint palette. But in the end, I only used about 7 or 8 colors. Occasionally, I would dip into some of the more esoteric colors in case I needed to do slight tweaks to some of the passages within the painting. For the beginner painter, I would suggest a much more limited palette. If you have a warm and a cool in each of the primary colors, along with a couple of earth pigments and black and white, you would have all you need to meet virtually any visual challenge. I should also note that my color palette and material selection is ever evolving. I am always experimenting, as art making is a lifelong learning endeavor. A croquis is a rough sketch or a draft. They are also referred to as a thumbnail sketch. They are termed this because of their small size. This is a chance for the artist to quickly jot down the concept and quickly establish the idea without any details. I cannot overemphasize enough the importance of doing as many thumbnail sketches as possible to exhaust all potential compositional ideas. These can be created in virtually any drawing media, from pencil and paper to ink. The composition that I eventually settled on was actually one of the first ideas I had. This was jotted down from memory. I explored literally dozens of vantages and lighting scenarios, but in the end I felt that one of my first ideas was the strongest. Almost always I feel that my strongest compositions are the ones that are developed from memory recall. Often the longer it sits in my mind, the stronger it becomes. Drawing from memory helps us distill the scene from details and develop the large mass relationships. It takes a bit of practice, but over time it becomes very fluid and can be a very effective way to develop visual ideas. After much exploring, I decided not to include the left-flanking American and Bridal Veil Falls. This would push the vantage so far away as to not experience the vantage on an intimate level, truly feeling the dramatic size and power of the falls that I felt when I was in close proximity. A notan is a variation of a croquis. This Japanese concept is a design principle that is a harmony of light and dark masses or shapes. They are typically developed as a two-value abstract with very few shapes. It is a way to explore eye movement in a very distilled and graphic image. Here I push the concept of a notan into a four-value map or block-in. Notans can be developed in paint, ink, pencil, and even on the computer. Etude is a musical term for an exercise or study. Visual artists can create etudes as a form of reference gathering. Typically, these are done in plein air, or outside. Once a solid direction has been determined via a croquis, I made a list of all the elements I would need to gather visual references of through field studies. These would become my visual library in lieu of photographs. This extensive list included all aspects of water, including the rapids, the cascade, the mist, and the currents below the falls. The landmass information I needed included the trees, the moss, brush and ground plants, the rocks, and the cliffs. For the sky, I would need to understand the dome of the sky, as well as cloud formations. I needed to understand the unique visual phenomena of the rainbow, as well as subtle details that I might include, such as the birds that reside there. During my many visits to Niagara, I spent time taking detailed notes on color relationships, temperatures, values, and hues, as well as pigment mixtures that may help me achieve these results. I also did detailed drawing studies using various media. Some of the plein air color studies included a visit to the American side, where I tried to understand some of the principal elements of the falls, including the rapids, the rising mist, and the formation of the rainbow. Here you can see one of the challenges of painting in plein air under the Niagara Falls mist. On one of my visits to the Canadian side, I found a beautiful vista that offered a complete view of the Horseshoe Falls. Here I tried to study and understand the topography and the anatomy of the landscape. This included the rock cliffs and structures, the cascade, as well as the dramatic and ever-changing currents below the falls. In the end, I walked away with dozens of sketches and color studies. But perhaps the most valuable information I walked away with came in the form of the detailed notes that I wrote down. These side notations on the drawings often give me information on pigments, value relationships and temperatures, atmospheric phenomena, as well as light and shadow interactions. Using the information that I gathered in the field from countless studies, I created over a dozen color explorations in the studio, where I worked out the technical challenges and color harmonies for dealing with the various aspects and nuances of the falls before embarking on a large painting. Inspired by the incomparable James Gurney, I decided to make a small model or maquette of the Niagara escarpment. This helped me compose and understand the arrangement, and I found it most helpful in designing the lighting. I will use this to explain some of the perspective and the lighting design. Technically, the vantage I depicted does exist, but there is no easy way to see it. You would need to be hovering about 250 yards back and slightly to the left of the center of the falls when you're facing it. A similar scene can be seen from the Rainbow Bridge about 3/4 of a mile below the falls. But because of the distance of this vantage, the proportional relationships of the land, the falls, and the distant tree masses are significantly compressed. In other words, the vista from the Rainbow Bridge is so far back from the falls that the height of the falls and the height of the distant trees appear almost equal, and thus the falls do not seem nearly as large and dramatic. Because of this, I took artistic liberties to move my vantage closer to the falls, adjusting some of the proportional and size relationships. The tree masses above the falls are intentionally compressed in size to make them feel further from the falls, thus emphasizing the height of the cascade. By doing this, I'm trying to make the viewer feel more intimate and closer to the scene, and make the falls feel more grand in size. The closer vantage also makes the viewer feel that the cascade is more grand and expansive, just as I felt when I was in its presence. I want the viewer to experience the immensity of the falls and walk away with a quiet reverence. Also, the point of view is technically neutral. It is right on the American and Canadian border. This implies that the falls belongs to no one, but everyone. It is a gift. The scene depicts early morning light on the longest day of the year, June 21st. The sun rises at 5:38 a.m. on this day at about 53 degrees northeast. Around 7:30 a.m., the sun is now at 70 degrees northeast and is high enough to cast a distinct light and shadow line going from the upper left American side, angling down towards the lower base of the Canadian side. The dramatic light split that I experienced in the early morning made for both a subtle visual statement about the allegory of light and dark, or good and evil, and also made for a strong compositional lead and connection between the American and Canadian landmasses. It was my goal to evoke an ephemeral and sublime experience. To quote Ruskin, art should be about evoking the feeling of transcendence, of sublime, of repose. All beauty, then, relates to the nature of God, and, if properly understood, is theophany, but typical beauty, the symbolizing of divine attributes in matter. Thus, it most directly partakes of the holy. Ruskin likes to think about the allegory of nature as God's art. I like to think that I glean from Ruskin's theories in my endeavors. Traditionally looked at as a symbol of peace and forgiveness, I decided to include the rainbow as a spiritual element within the landscape. The depiction of a rainbow with pigments presents a unique challenge for the artist. Convincingly portraying this beautiful natural phenomena turned out to be one of the most difficult challenges of this painting. The starting point is observing, studying, and understanding how a rainbow forms. Allow me to spend a moment explaining the physics and science behind their formation. In order to observe a rainbow, there are some very specific circumstances that need to be in place. First, there must be an unobstructed sun behind the viewer. Second, there must be mist in the air in front of the viewer in the form of falling rain or uprising mist from a waterfall. And third, the viewer must direct their gaze towards the water mist. Sunlight is composed of all the colors, and we perceive it as white light. The separation of the white light into a spectrum is obvious in a traditional prism. The sun's light enters the individual water droplets in the form of rain or mist and refracts within these drops like microprisms. During the refraction or bending of light, the separation of the individual bands of colors occurs. The light is then reflected off the inner back wall of the droplet. Once again, the light refracts as it exits the droplet. During this process of refracting, reflecting, and refracting again, the individual colors contained in the white light are split between 40 and 42 degrees. Each color bending at a slightly different angle, since their frequencies are slightly different. Red has a higher frequency, and violet has a lower frequency. Thus, red is seen on the outer ring of the rainbow, and violet on the inside. The effect of splitting the rays into millions of microspectrums, working together at fixed angles, results in the rainbow phenomena. Since we typically observe the rainbow from the Earth, the circle is interrupted by the horizon line. The rainbow will be centered around the shadow of the head of the viewer. This is known as the anti-solar point.
This is defined as the imaginary point exactly opposite the sun, 180 degrees in relation to the observer. Again, this is not a fixed point. Each observer will have their own unique antisolar point that will change position as they move. The sunlight will refract at 40 to 42 degrees from the antisolar point in the primary rainbow. When the situation is just right, a double rainbow can be observed. The dark space between them is called Alexander's dark band. The secondary outer rainbow will be less intense and the colors will be reversed. The secondary rainbow results when the sunlight bounces twice inside of the water droplet at about 52 degrees from the antisolar point. Once I had a full understanding of the composition and the lighting, I was then able to orchestrate how and where to place the rainbow. The time of year and day allowed me to take advantage of the angle of the sunrise being furthest behind the observer. The sun is located behind the left shoulder of the observer. This brings the rainbow close to the center of the falls from this vantage. The artist should keep in mind the basic physics of the formation of a rainbow before starting. The biggest challenge is that the rainbow will be both the brightest and most chromatic occurrence in the scene. This is very difficult to achieve, since the value range of the artist's pigments, which is seen in reflected light, is dramatically more compressed than natural emitted light. I decided to achieve this by painting a semi-opaque white over the underpainting of the landscape, then glazing the pure spectral colors on top of the white. This process took several layers of glazing and scumbling until I achieved the subtle look I desired. The complete process will be revealed in the film. Visual artists must be conscious and aware of developing a strong composition right from the beginning. In the classroom or academic setting, the terms good and bad composition are often tossed around. Often it's hard to articulate why one work of art has a strong composition and another does not. But we innately do know good composition when we see it. Composition refers to the movement of the eye through the pictorial space. As artists, we're often thinking and using the art elements and principles, such as rhythm and harmony, symmetry and asymmetry, balance, emphasis, and all the other terms that are referred to as the language of art. These are simply tools and methods to help you organize the pictorial space. Simply by using these terms, we can quickly see the correlation between visual art and music. There are many books and resources for the artist to study and explore composition in depth. Compositional types, or models, are used to describe the overall shape of the movement of the eye in a work of art. These models are determined by the subject, the concept, and quite often by both. The L model encourages the eye to move vertically and horizontally, or vice versa. An O model directs the eye to move in a circular fashion. In a radiating model, there is an implied movement to and from one particular spot. The S-curve encourages entrance into the composition in a meandering fashion. The Steelyard model suggests an asymmetrical composition, often heavier on one side than the other, with a visual fulcrum point near the heavier side. In the T composition, the eye moves vertically up and then flanks out to the opposing sides. In the triangle composition, the eye is encouraged to alternate between 3 points of interest. In the U model, the implied movement is a vertical down, a horizontal across, and a vertical up. The X model is very similar to the radiating in that there's a center point of intersection, but often the masses are more simplified. Compositional models work hand in hand with armatures. A basic armature that most artists are familiar with is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds structure is accomplished when you divide the pictorial space into 3 quadrants vertically and horizontally, achieving 4 intersections. These are areas to consider anchoring points of interest in your composition. The rule of thirds is actually derived from more complex harmonic armatures. These harmonic armatures have been used for hundreds of years by visual artists and architects. Compositional armatures were derived from musical harmonies, or proportions that are pleasing to our ears. The audible proportions are translated into visual proportions, or harmonies, in the form of intersections and leading lines. These visual sweet spots are good places to consider anchoring areas of interest or angles of masses to lead the eye through the composition. There are several armatures the artist can choose from to ensure that the design is visually pleasing. These include the root 2 and the root 3 harmonies, as well as the golden mean. I'm using a more generic harmonic armature that can be configured to virtually any rectangular proportion, from a long, thin rectangle to a square. In this generic harmonic armature, the areas of the heaviest intersections correspond to the rule of thirds. But if you only rely on the rule of thirds, you will deprive yourself of countless other arrangement options. Once you've created the armature, it can initially look overwhelming. There are many leading lines and intersections for you to consider using. In the end, I often only use 2 or 3 intersections and a handful of leading lines. But these are carefully orchestrated to take advantage of the visual harmonies. As with any formula in art, it should be taken as a guide for consideration. True artistry happens in the inflection and the nuances that break beyond the formula. An esquisse is a preliminary sketch plan of the design or composition. It is a more refined drawing than a croquis or a thumbnail, and is accurate to the scale of the final painting. After doing a lot of exploring of various proportions, I settled on an 8-foot by 30-inch format for the final painting, as I felt it would best capture the size, expanse, and awe of the concept that I envisioned. I proportionally scaled down the composition to refine the design in pencil. This composition is developed primarily from memory, but it's informed and reinforced from my field sketches, paintings, and notes. I should note that I designed several other compositional explorations, just to be sure that I exhausted all other design possibilities. When developing the design for my Niagara composition, I ended up using a combination of the Steelyard and the U compositional models. I then brought in the generic compositional armature and locked in the key points. I then developed a contour line version of the composition. The next drawing I did was a tonal ink study. I began by transferring the contour drawing onto the toned paper using a sheet of white transfer paper This is similar to carbon paper. The purpose of the ink study is to understand the mass and value relationships of the composition in relatively simple terms without the color. I started by defining several key areas with a crow quill dip pen. I then used a watercolor reservoir brush with diluted ink to establish the large value masses. I then used a larger dip pen to push the darks and establish some of the detail. I use a variety of techniques including hatching, cross-hatching, and varied line application. I used white gouache, water, and a small brush to place in the light masses and subtle halftones. With the ink tonal study complete, I now have a clearer vision of my composition in simple mapped out values without the complication of color. Direct painting, or alla prima, is a painting approach that typically involves the completion of a painting in one sitting. Indirect painting, or layered painting, is a process involving the application of numerous layers of paint, typically letting them dry in between. This process can be more time-consuming, but the result can be a painting with a great deal of depth and luminosity. Indirect painting starts with a support often of metal, wood, canvas, or linen. A ground or a primer is applied to the support to seal it and prevent oils and solvents from seeping to the support, which can result in deterioration. The underpainting is the first structural layer or layers. An imprimatura is applied as a stain. This is typically an earth pigment diluted with mineral spirits and rubbed over the surface. This takes away the starkness of the white, making it easier to assess color and value relationships early on. When a monochromatic tonal or value range is established, often in raw umber, this is often referred to as a grisaille or gray painting. The first color pass is often called a dead color. These colors are not fully developed, are often laid in a very limited value range, and lighter in value to compensate for future glazing, which will result in darkening of a passage. The colors are also very low in chroma or gray. There is very little or no detail developed at this point. I often refer to this as the blurred pass. It is simply blocking in the big relationships. The extremes of the darks and the lights and the chromatic passages are left for future layers. The general term for an underpainting is an ébauche. The grisaille and the dead color are simply two of many variations of an ébauche. The underpainting is always applied lean. This means that the paint is always applied thinly and often diluted with mineral spirits. The purpose of the underpainting is to establish the big composition, the big value relationships, and a sound understructure. The overpainting is often done in multiple layers. These layers are applied with less diluted paint with mineral spirits. They are often referred to as fat, meaning they have a higher oil content. The subsequent layers after the underpainting oscillate between opaque and transparent passages. Glazing passages can result in luminous and transparent effects. This involves applying a transparent pigment, typically warm, over a lighter underpainting. This gives the effect of darkening and warming, as you might optically see in shadows. Scumbling is an opaque light pigment over a dark passage. This gives the effect of lightening and cooling. This is a wonderful approach to create the illusion of atmosphere. The goal of the glazes and the scumbles is to allow some of the underpainting to scintillate through, creating interesting optical effects. The purpose of the progressive overpainting layers is to continually adjust the temperature and value relationships of each passage in relation to what it's next to. After the painting has been allowed to dry adequately, a top-coat varnish is applied. This protects the painting from UV light and pollutants. It also resaturates colors that may have oiled out or sunken in and become dull. It is important to choose a varnish that is easily removed. Before I move on to the demonstration of the painting itself, I would like to take a moment and explain my thought process in regards to dealing with space and form in the landscape. Whether I'm working on a studio painting or painting in plein air, there's always some basic principles that are in the back of my mind as I deal with the challenges of each individual painting. I think a lot of artists, including myself, easily get caught up in the details of working in a landscape and attempt to translate the form too early on in the painting process. Perhaps a better approach is to focus on dealing with pushing the space and the depth in their picture plane. One of the last things I tend to deal with is turning the form and resolving the details. Here's a graphic example of a landscape interpreted in flat black and white. If you can begin to visualize your landscape in simple black and white values, the initial painting stages will be much easier. Some basic principles to consider regarding the value hierarchy would be as follows. The lightest value in a landscape will always be the sky dome. This is because it is the source of the light. The only exception to the sky being the lightest value would be incidents of local color that are white, such as a snow scene or a white building. The mid-tone values will always be held by the horizontal masses. An example of this would be a grass field. The darkest values will always be the vertical masses, such as trees and mountains. I'm now going to take the simple black and white landscape and break it down into the three value structures of the sky, the horizontal planes, and the vertical masses. The light mass of the sky is first established. I applied a subtle gradient to indicate the value transition of the sky dome. It is typically darkest at the apex and transitions down to the lightest value near the horizon. The medium value now represents the horizontal planes. A similar but opposite occurrence occurs with a value gradation being darkest near the viewer and transitioning to a lighter value in the distance. Water is considered a horizontal plane. Although it is reflecting the sky or any landmass above it, the reflection of the lights into the water will be slightly darker in value, and any reflections of a dark shadow will be slightly lighter in value. In other words, the value structure in the reflections is slightly more compressed than the source of the reflections. Just like in the sky, there will be a reflection of the value change going from dark in the foreground to light in the distance. The dark, upright masses are now indicated. The plane that transitions from the flat top of the field to the flat water is a vertical drop, and thus will appear darker in value. A foreground mass of trees is laid in as a dark value as well, and the reflection is indicated in the water. Note that it's slightly lighter in value than the source. The middle ground tree masses are placed in still darker than the horizontal mass, but slightly lighter since it's further into space. The distant mountain that has trees on it will demonstrate this same principle. It's lighter than the vertical masses in the foreground and middle ground, yet darker than the adjacent field at that distance. The farthest and highest mountain, which is still a vertical plane, will now be darker than the sky, but lighter than the mountains in front of it. Keeping in mind this simple principle of light, medium, and darks as they correlate to the sky dome, the horizontal masses, and the vertical masses, is helpful in the initial stages of compositional development and massing. The principles of value structure in the development of space and depth, as well as color and light in the turning of form, can then be applied to the principle of atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is the illusion of depth in space by using the influence of air. There are many variables that interact with and affect our perception of objects in the distance within a landscape. Time of day, time of year, humidity, precipitation, pollution, and the angle of the sun are just a few of the influences that will affect how objects look at a distance. In this generic landscape, containing a meandering river, I'll explain some of the principles as they apply to color. I would like to take the explanation of values in the landscape a little further as it applies to atmospheric perspective. In this graphic below the landscape, the left side refers to the darkest values and the right side to the lightest values. Objects that advance in the picture plane and are closest to the viewer will have the widest value range, from the deepest darks to the lightest lights. Overall, the value in the foreground will be darker. As objects recede back into space, the value range is much more compressed. The darks will appear much lighter, and the lights will appear a bit darker. Overall, the background will appear lighter. The saturation of color refers to a color's intensity. In the simple graphic below the landscape, the left side would represent a saturated color, and the right side would represent a neutral or gray color. Colors that are advancing into the foreground will overall feel more saturated and intense. As those same colors recede into space, they will overall feel more desaturated and neutral. The temperature of a color refers to its apparent warmth or cool in relation to what it's next to. Each color family will have variations of warm and cool. In other words, you can have a warm red and a cool red, a warm blue and a cool blue, as well as a warm yellow and a cool yellow. In this example, the graphic on the bottom represents a warm green on the left and a cool green on the right. When an object advances towards the viewer in a picture plane, it will appear overall warmer. As that same object goes back into space, it will appear cooler. I also want to mention this unique phenomena as green recedes into space. Green is made up of various proportions of the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, or according to many color theories, cyan, magenta, and yellow. One of the early colors to drop out of the spectrum is yellow. If we have the green that is made up of red, yellow, and blue, and we remove the yellow, we are left with various proportions of red and blue. Red and blue together make a violet. Thus, mountains at a distance often have a violet cast to them. The next color to drop out of the spectrum would be red or magenta. If we take that out of the green mixture, we are left with blue. Thus, mountains in a great distance will often appear a very light blue color. As colors recede into space, the overall will appear cooler. Once I've successfully achieved the illusion of depth and space within my landscape, my efforts go towards turning the form of the masses and the individual objects. This is an explanation of my thought process as I begin to mix colors for individual objects. These principles can be applied to a mountain range, a cloud, a rock, or in this case, a tree. In this demonstration of the tree, the first color I would attempt to mix would be the average local color of this specific tree. The next color I would develop would be the dark inside of the canopy. Because the canopy is being illuminated from the outside and the leaves are thin and transparent, they will allow the warm light of the outside to influence the dark shadows within. So this dark neutral green will have a warmer temperature. Now I begin to think about the generic shape of the outside of the tree and how various light sources will influence the color. I begin with the main light source, in this case the sun. When the warm sun illuminates the right side of the tree canopy, the average local color of the green will lighten in value and lean towards a yellow hue. Because the sun is so intense, this color will be a bit washed out. The right side of the tree shape will not be receiving sun, but will be illuminated by the blue sky. When this light blue sky illuminates the local color, it will lighten in value and lean towards a blue-green. Initially, we may think of the bottom of the shape of the tree to be very dark in value. Although it will be darker in value than the top, in this case it is actually illuminated by the bright sunlit grass below it. Thus, the local color of the tree at the bottom will be one of the most intense colors. In this example, I also put in a sunlit rock mass on the right side. When the sun illuminates the right side of the rocks, it becomes a bright, warm gray. When the light of this bright, warm gray illuminates the local color on the right side, the result is a lighter value, neutral green that becomes almost gray. This is in part because the warm gray of the rock has red in it, and when red is added to green, it neutralizes the color. This basic approach to turning form in the landscape is a very logical way to concept your way through a painting, even if you don't have reference.
Niagara Falls. One of the great wonders of the world. In the 19th century, Niagara was the ultimate subject for Hudson River School painters like Frederick Church, Thomas Cole, Jasper Francis Cropsey, Sanford Robinson Gifford, and George Innes, who spent huge sums of time trying to conquer the falls in paint. For painters, Niagara is the most challenging subject to master in order to represent its power, its magnitude, its scale. Few artists have ever attempted the difficult task of mastering Niagara Falls since the 19th century, but one artist set out on a mission to master the falls in a monumental and historic painting. Thomas Kegler is a master painter whose style harkens back to this groundbreaking period in American art, and one of the major instructors in the world-renowned Hudson River Fellowship, which attracts the finest students in the world to study under Kegler. And in this all-new 8-hour instructional video, he takes you through his complete step-by-step studio painting process as he creates his awe-inspiring masterwork entitled Niagara, Psalms 84:11. Combining vivid detail and a nuanced sense of expression, this 8-foot sweeping depiction of the most well-known waterfalls in the world will simply take your breath away. and Thomas will show you every technique he uses to create it. You'll discover how to create initial on-location sketches, including the critical points to consider in your initial notes and studies. You'll also discover Kegler's techniques for painting the sky, rainbow, various parts of different waterfalls, water flow at the bottom of the falls, the mist, cascades, rock cliff moss, plus several fascinating techniques for creating water and the falls, and much, much more. In Painting Niagara, Thomas Kegler shares his entire creation process, from the very first steps of creating the concept to adding the final details to your work, including frame design. If you've ever wanted to master waterfalls and painting water, join master artist Thomas Kegler and embark on your own exciting studio and plan your air painting experience today. Painting Niagara, a masterclass in studio painting, is now available on DVD and streaming video.
Well, that's Thomas Kegler and Painting Niagara. This video is very extensive, the whole thing, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. What a great way to learn landscape painting from this guy. By the way, there's a special discount code in the comments section. Make sure you check that out. It's for today only. Now let's get right to our interview with Thomas Kegler. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. We're here in the library of the Salmagundi Club, world-famous Salmagundi Club, which has been the home of many of America's great artists for well over 100 years. And we're in this classic historic library, and it's absolutely stunning because it's filled with history. There are palettes all around the walls, and the palettes belong to the various members. There are hundreds, probably thousands of antique books, books where you can do research on virtually any artist in the world. And there's a collection of mugs which were used as a fundraiser back 100 years ago. They gave the mugs to various artists, and they each painted a mug, and then they fired them and turned them into the mugs that they are, and then they sold them. They used them as fundraisers, but there's a lot of them here back in the collection. So this is a remarkably kind of romantic place as a painter. We're sitting in a room where literally the best painters in the world hung out, spent their time, smoked cigars, and talked about art. And so we thought it would be appropriate today, when we're interviewing Thomas Kegler, to come here to the Salmagundi Club because he's such an important part of our contemporary art history. Tom, welcome.
It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here with you, Eric, as well as in this amazing room at the Salmagundi Club.
Pretty humbling, isn't it?
Very humbling.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is a place that's about artists, and one thing that's pretty clear when you come to this place, you walk through the halls of the Salmagundi Club, and there are hundreds of world-class paintings. And it's clear that these are artists who studied their craft with passion. They studied it for decades, and they just got better and better and produced amazing works. And that's why we wanted to bring you here, because you're such an important part of contemporary art history in America. You're doing such amazing paintings, and of course, recently, which we'll talk about, something really important and monumental. So why don't we start out with the journey? Help us understand how this all began. What are your first recollections of art?
I was fortunate that I grew up in a family that really nurtured art. My parents were hardworking. They owned a mom and pop sporting goods store, which also ironically had a little mini art gallery attached to it, which was predominantly wildlife art back in the 80s. When I first started out, I can recall way back to when I was a kid, most of my time was not spent with traditional sports and such. I was outside. I grew up in a family that hunted and fished and camped. And my earliest recollections are spending a lot of time outdoors. And when I was home, I was typically at the table, drawing, painting, using lots of crayons and scissors and whatever else I had to create. And that was really instilled in me very early on. Come high school days, the high school that I went to actually had no art program, not a single art class. The closest I could come was, I think they called it technical drawing at the time. But fortunately, I'm one of 9 kids. And on the younger scale, most of my older siblings were going to school for, many of them were graphic designers. So when they would come home with their college projects, I was inspired, and I often would mimic what they were doing. And I also found myself copying artwork that I really aspired to. And so that interest in art and that, I guess you'd call it talent, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but that talent was really nurtured and encouraged from a very young age. When I really started entertaining the idea of pursuing art as a career, there were a lot of voices around me, I think many of us hear, that you don't want to be a starving artist. And I found myself drawn to, for that reason, into graphic design. So my first pursuits were in the field of graphic design. I got my degree in it. I worked for several years as an illustrator as well as a graphic designer, both as a freelancer as well as at agencies. And I found myself the whole time I was working in these situations that I loved the creative side of it, but I was yearning for the early years when I was outside a lot. And I found myself questioning my career path, as I think a lot of people do. And it was around my mid-20s that I went through my early midlife crisis, I guess you'd say. And I had no ties at the time, so I ended up clearing my head. I went and I worked in Alaska for 2 years as a fly fishing guide. And that was a really life-changing experience.
How so?
I was immersed in what I loved. I was immersed in nature. I didn't see a TV, I didn't see a car, or running water out of a faucet for 3 months. We got our water out of a spring. Our transportation was basically a float plane or a boat. Living that primitively in a tent for such a long time, it really grounds you in many ways. And you learn how to see. We're so inundated today with contemporary media that I think it's a detriment to our observation skills.
Well, certainly, I think what seems to be happening is that we have so many things calling for our attention. Mm-hmm. And it's so fascinating in our society today. You know, people will look at this in 100 years and say this is probably insane. But, you know, in our society today, in the last few years, because of smartphones, you know, you go into a restaurant and you see, I noticed the other night, a family, all people in the family were looking down at their smartphones. They were no longer engaging and no longer talking to each other. And I think that we have become so accustomed to the stimuli that we get addicted to it. It's an addiction of checking your Facebook and checking your email and seeing if anybody is acknowledging you or paying attention to you, or posting something and then checking to see how many people looked at it or liked it or responded to it. And it's such an addiction. I find that in my particular case, I have to just check out. I have to take 2 or 3 weeks a year where I go somewhere and I turn it off and I don't check it at all, because otherwise I think, you know, your brain doesn't get a chance to go into a different place. So this is essentially what you were doing. Of course, this was all before smartphones and all that craziness. Yeah.
So after 2 years of working in Alaska, when I moved back, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But what I did discover during my time in Alaska is that I enjoyed working with people, and I enjoyed teaching people, because that was predominantly what I was working with. So it made sense to consider teaching, and prior to that I never really considered it. Having worked with people and starting to mature, I think, as a human being, we, I think, start to yearn for how we can give back. But it wasn't until I actually student taught that I realized that this was my calling. I really needed to be in the classroom. Art education made sense because I was painting and drawing all the while I was in Alaska.
Oh, you were?
Mm-hmm. It was predominantly through journaling. It wasn't like I was taking paints out into the field. Because I had that experience of growing up in the 80s, I was exposed to a lot of the wildlife art. So I was emulating a lot of these artists. I had the opportunity to meet people like Robert Bateman, as well as some of the other big hitters of the time. So it was very inspirational, and it made sense that wildlife, because I was immersed in nature. I was only outputting maybe 3 or 4 paintings a year for a variety of reasons. One is I felt that my aesthetic and my skill level weren't matched. I felt like I wasn't able to paint what I wanted to because I didn't have the training or the skill. I don't think I was mature enough at that time to dedicate what it took to get to that point. For an artist to succeed, or virtually anyone in any craft, you need 3 things. You need 1, talent, 2, passion, and 3, a very good work ethic. The least important of those 3, I think, is talent. As a teacher, I've seen this many times. Students that are gifted with a talent that don't have the passion or the hard work will fall short. While you take a student that has a little bit of a talent, but has this amazing passion and a work ethic, it will more than compensate for a lack in talent.
So I just am reading the book by the man who created the Suzuki method. His name is Suzuki. I don't remember his first name. And one of the early statements in the book is that there is no such thing as talent. That most of the young, quote unquote, talented students who are out on stage, who picked up a violin and are playing amazing pieces, were not talented at all, did not have any natural inborn gifts, but the talent came really from training. They were trained into talent. And one of the things that I think is really critical for people to understand, this is my belief, and I'd like to get your opinion on it, but you know, when I'm outdoors painting, inevitably every time if I'm in a public place, someone will walk up and they'll say, you know, I wish I had that talent. I can't draw a straight line. I don't have this in me. And I always say to them, there's no such thing as talent. And maybe talent comes into play in the last 10% of your ability to paint when, you know, somebody might be a whole lot better than somebody else. But usually talent is about learning a process and practicing a process. And I have found, for instance, you know, the people who are exceptionally talented, like yourself, for instance, like Jeremy Lipking, for instance, these people put thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of practice and learning from others who are better than they are, or someone who can teach them. So how do you feel about that?
I think you could say that in many ways talent is synonymous with skill, and skill and technique are a learned method. Now, some people have a predisposition to have a really good eye and see things, and that's going to speed up the process of acquiring the skill and the talent. But in the end, I think it's through experience and putting the miles on, and through potentially good education or mentoring. Those all plug into the umbrella of talent. So some people have been born with this gift of a good eye, and perhaps a hand-eye coordination that plugs in well to an aesthetic. But in the end, that all gets well-rounded and fulfilled through the passion and through the hard work.
I think the message for the people who are watching this video, for instance, is if you were discouraged, just give it some time. You know, the best way to get out of any growth problem is to just keep practicing. And though you can practice badly, So you want to get some good instruction. And if you get good instruction, somebody like Thomas, watching videos like this, you know, that repeating the process, just don't ever give up, because you'll be frustrated. And what I found, Thomas, is that most of the artists that I know, and probably know hundreds of them, most of the artists I know have all been at a place where they were discouraged, they thought about quitting, they just didn't feel like they were making any progress. They get to certain points in their career, if you will, even if they're not professionals, their painting life, where they can't get any further and they give up. And then something triggers a change. For instance, you know, when you get to that level of frustration, that, I think, says you're about to take a big leap in growth. And so we should look at these moments of frustration as gifts.
Absolutely.
Instead of looking at them as problems. I remember Scott Christensen and I went to Russia, and following the trip, he called me and he said, "Eric, I'm going to stop painting." And I said, "What do you mean you're going to stop painting?" And he said, "Well, I can't do it anymore." He says, "I was so overwhelmed by looking at Shishkin and Levitan and all these guys repping in Russia and the quality of their work." He said, "I just realized I can't ever get there." And I said, "You can get there." He said, "But I can't paint the same way anymore." And I said, "Just keep at it, just keep doing it." And so he called me about 3 months later. He said, "It took me 3 months, but I finally broke through to the next level." So even somebody who's an iconic painter like that has gone through those experiences. What kind of experiences have you gone through?
Yeah, I think all artists go through trials, and in the end, I think you will learn far more from your frustrations and your quote-unquote failures than you ever will from your successes. Successes will make you feel good, but it's temporary. It's the failures that embolden you. It's what adds to your knowledge, and if you're inspired, you're going to find ways of overcoming those challenges, and it becomes part of your tools, your tool chest when you're in the field, both mentally and physically, in terms of equipment. I remember the first time I ever painted outside. It was in my mid-20s. A friend of mine called me and said, "Let's go paint outside." And this is before I even heard the term plein air. And we went to a local spot, and we did everything you could possibly do wrong. We brought way too much equipment. We set up in the middle of a sunny field with the sun beating on our canvas, and we didn't have the right mediums, the paint thinners. It was a very disheartening experience for me. It made no sense. Why would you do this to yourself? And it was 10 years before I painted outside again.
For those who might be watching this and have not experienced painting outside, I think just to point out a couple of things that about plein air painting. I publish, as you know, Plein Air magazine, and we teach a lot of that. And so the references that you made, taking too much stuff, you know, those people who have perfected the art of plein air painting gotten to the point of getting it all into a small backpack rather than, you know, taking the whole studio out, which is what I did my first time. Secondly, they don't try to paint in direct sunlight because your pupils are dilated, and as a result, it throws off the values of your paintings. And values, for those who might not know, are the levels of grayscale, if you will, you know, dark to light. So when you paint outside in bright light and you bring it back into the house into normal light, you get usually an overly dark painting.
Exactly.
Right.
It's overly dark. Almost always I will revisit a painting by hanging it on the wall and assessing it under the light it's going to live in. And I think that helps a lot.
I do know painters who will paint in direct light, but they have some little tricks they employ, turning the canvas around into the shade so they can get a feel for it and so on.
Yeah.
So you didn't go back to plein air painting for 10 years.
10 years, yeah. But all the while I was still painting. I found myself, because I knew no better, using predominantly photographs. What I found through using photographs early on in my painting was that I found myself not being able to get any better. I was definitely finding myself limited by the photographs and what they offered, which was limitations on value structures, limitations on understanding the nuances of temperatures in paintings, especially in the colors. It took a long time for me to figure out what I was doing wrong. I'm a self-taught painter. I've never taken a class or a workshop.
Wow.
I've read a lot of books, and most of my education in painting took place within the last 10 years.
So let me ask this question. This is probably a hard question. But knowing what you know now, and if you had to do it all over again, would you still go for being self-taught, or would you try to have found an excellent mentor who could have got you to where you want to be? And would you have ended up in the same place?
That's a great question. I think there's something to be said by not taking the straight road to get to your goal. Because all along the winding road, you're picking up tools from places you may not have considered. So for instance, my career in graphic design taught me about composition, taught me about color, taught me about simplifying the visual space. Had I gone right into mentoring with a painter, I may have lost out on those benefits. I think there's something to be said about studying with a mentor, with a master painter. You're going to learn the tools of the trade. You're going to learn work ethic. You're going to learn just how to construct a painting in a way that's going to last. And those can be found in books, and that's how I've acquired them. But there's something much more tangible about doing it hands-on with someone.
Yeah, well, so in a book, you know, there's only so much you can get out of a book, but when you're side by side, that's why these videos are so powerful.
Yes.
Is because, I mean, wouldn't we love to have a video of George Ennis or one of those guys painting anybody? I mean, they just didn't exist in that time, and there are people who have explained things, but we don't really have the full picture in some cases. Some cases are well documented.
Exactly. So if I were to do it all again, I'm not sure I would do anything different. I'm pretty happy with the way my life the path has gone.
You went into school, you got your teaching degree. Did you start teaching art?
My teaching degree is in art, which covers K to 12. And when you're certified in art, you're pretty much expected to be able to teach virtually any kind of visual art, from sculpture to video to drawing and painting. And that's one of the things I love about my job, is that I do teach all of those. I challenge students three-dimensionally as well as two-dimensionally, media as well as still. It has helped me develop my own eye for my own art making. I'd like to think they give me as much as I give them. And just listening to the way they talk about their art, or their color sensibility, or their compositional sensibilities, I'm always picking up on that. And the other thing is, through teaching, it's forced me to be able to talk about art processes that are normally much more intuitive, and that you do subjectively without really thinking about it. By forcing myself to be able to talk about how to do these things, I find myself, when I'm painting, that I'm doing it in a much more structured way. Not that I'm still not enjoying the creative process and the spontaneity. That's certainly still there, but I've found that, especially things like composition, I'm really thinking through about my placement of things, so that I'm creating an engaging two-dimensional space that the viewer hopefully will be able to spend some time on and enjoy the process of the way the eye moves through it. I taught 2 years elementary, and I've been teaching the last 18 years in the same high school, and it's a gift. I consider myself fortunate. Every day when I wake up, I look forward to going to school. I look forward to going to teaching and challenging these young students.
And have you heard from students who caught the bug, you know, that you taught many, many years ago, who are now out and have become artists?
That's probably the best part of teaching, is that we all have our bad days, and we all question our drive or our point or our direction in life. And I find that sometimes when I'm feeling that way, things kind of play out where I just happen to run into a past student that I had 5 or 10 years ago. And they'll say that I'm pursuing something in the arts now, and it was because you said this back in high school when I was there. And that's when it really hits home as to why I do this, and it really is very fulfilling.
So you started going out painting again, and you started developing this reputation as being kind of a modern day Hudson River School painter who has matched, or quite frankly, in some cases, I think exceeded the quality of some of those painters.
Thank you. That's very humbling.
That's, and I know that would be hard to buy, but I think from my perspective, you know, you're really one of the great landscape painters of our time, and maybe of all time. And so how did this develop? You started going back outside because you were not getting what you wanted out of photographs. And I think for the viewer, and I didn't understand this when I first started painting, and I was painting from photographs. Photographs lie.
Absolutely.
So first off, the lens is curved, so your perspective is a little askew. Secondly, the shadows are always darker in a photograph. Now with modern technology, it's getting better. But still, photographs are typically darker in the shadows. The lights, the exposures are blown out, right? So if you take a picture of a landscape with a landscape in the sky, either the sky is perfectly exposed or the landscape is perfectly exposed. But what you can see when someone paints from a photo is that, you know, if the landscape is exposed, they've painted it that way, and then the sky is blown out and they've painted it that way. So, so that's where it fools the eye. And then of course, there's color and values. Photographs tend to lean cool. Depends on, of course, the settings, because time of day, you know, you can get certain warmth and so on, but the cameras always lie.
Right.
And so you really got off this track on photographs at some point.
I wish it was that night and day. Back in I think it was 2005, I was still painting back at that time, and I actually had a really life-changing accident that I guess it was kind of a wake-up call, and I look at it as a gift. I had a severe injury to the forearm of my drawing hand through a chainsaw. It actually went right to the bone, and I still had permanent damage from that. I went through the typical grieving process and the healing process. The first thing I did the day after was I painted a picture, and it was a landscape. It was from photographs. For me, it was a wake-up call. I felt this incredible drive. I need to do something with this gift that I've been given. I need to develop it. I need to take it to another level. During the month that I was healing from this, I ordered a stack of art books, and I read the whole time. And I like to say I came out of that like a racehorse. So I went from painting 3 to 4 paintings a year to what I'm currently doing is close to 100.
Are you really?
Yep. Now, obviously, you know, from this size to this size.
Yeah, but to produce 100 paintings, and I know that you're a quality freak, so that's, you've really learned to speed up the process.
Through experience comes efficiency. Through efficiency comes speed and confidence.
So you know, you've said a couple of times that you look at bad experiences as gifts. I sense there may be a little bit of a spiritual relationship. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure, sure. I have had a life grounded in faith since early childhood. It was part of our home. That combined with my experiences in nature, as well as my art, have always been integral. And most of my paintings have a biblical verse tied in with the title. And for me, it's an invitation to the viewer to look up the verse and consider it, and hopefully find some connection between the verse, the painting, and maybe their own lives. It's not meant to be a literal title. It's more of an engaging title. So when I'm out there in the field and I'm painting, I'm being infused with creation. And that's something that I discovered that a photograph is dead with. And I think by painting from field paintings into your studio paintings and using those as reference, it brings that back. It brings that spiritual or emotional level that you experience when you're outside right into the painting.
So I painted with and am good friends with some of the great living Russian painters today in Russia. And most of them have very strong faith as well. Most of them are Russian Orthodox.
Yeah.
And one of them told me that his paintings come to him through stillness. That he goes out, he sets up his easel in something that, in an area that speaks to him, and he just stands there and absorbs it and takes it in, and he says that he's in a constant state of prayer.
That's great.
And even though it's not, you know, the act of prayer as we typically would think of it, you know, where he's talking and so on, he said that he's in a constant state of praise and prayer, and that the Spirit then moves him, and he stays in that state while he paints. He said it's like a meditative state.
Wonderful.
Is that kind of what you experience?
I'm going to have to try that, because it sounds like a wonderful approach. My typical approach is to start the day with a painting through prayer. I ask God to prosper and bless the work of my hand through the brush. Then I just kind of let the painting evolve. There's obviously a lot of planning involved, but the actual act of painting to me it's a burst of adrenaline and energy. That's why I can't paint at night, because I'll find myself up at 3 in the morning. So I've actually reversed that, and now I get up at 4 in the morning and I paint for several hours before I go and teach. Wow. And that way I've got to leave the studio, there's something special about leaving the studio wanting more too, as opposed to leaving it exhausted. It's something I look forward to every morning.
I think one message to the viewer here, at some point you need to get outside and paint. You don't want to do it too early. You want to learn, I think anyway, you want to learn kind of the basics of painting, how to mix your colors, how to deal with all of those things, because you don't want to have to figure that stuff out and deal with blowing wind in nature and light and changing clouds and everything else. But ultimately, that's where you want to be, because that's where you're going to get the most sense of form, the most sense of light. And sometimes they're fleeting, right? Yeah, I would assume that sometimes you do pretty rapid studies just to, you know, like the clouds change, the light comes in, and you're like, boom, I got to grab that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've found over the years that sometimes taking a mental picture is very effective. And then while it's still fresh in your mind, so for instance, driving down the road, you see this amazing sunset. Stare at it for a minute, take a mental picture. As soon as you get home, even if it's just using pastels or watercolor, get it on paper. And then you can develop that further. There's something special about a burned-in visual image in the mind that it gets distilled to a very simple form. And the details, which are the least important anyway, get eliminated through that memory photograph. That I found has been really effective for me.
You have to train yourself to do that.
It takes a lot of training.
And yet, to make that point, we have all walked into a museum or a gallery, seen a painting, glanced at it for a brief period of time, and we can't get that painting out of our head for the rest of our life.
I was actually teaching my students, and I came across a George Inness. I'll never forget it. It was one of his more humble ones. It was Home of the Heron, which is a very deep, dark, kind of like a swamp scene, glowing background through some trees and just a little silhouette of a heron in there. That painting moved me, and it's not one of his more, you know, amazing sunsets. That one has stuck with me, and that's what I want to do with my work, is create work that has some kind of universal attraction, that has simplicity, that there's something beautiful in the ambiguous, and I think that resonates with a lot of people, and trying to capture, I think, the spirit in the experience as opposed to the detail.
I was in Florence a couple of weeks ago, and I was with the great teacher Daniel Graves, who does amazing landscape work. You don't see much of it because he's known as such a figure painter. But he said something to me which I had not really thought as much about and articulated. He said, one of the problems we have in our culture of artists is that we're learning technique and we're able to paint what we see. He said, but a good painting goes beyond painting what we see. It goes into touching, having a sense of a spiritual connection or a sense of emotion. And he said a good painter can go out on location and then use what he sees to create something that is maybe even more remarkable than what he sees.
I completely agree with that. I think during the training process, I think it's very important that an artist learns to draw what they see. Then once they've developed that technique in the eye to be able to do that, that gives them a knowledge. If you're painting a figure, you have the knowledge of anatomy that frees you to be able to be much more creative with the positioning, even if you're making it up, because you're basing it on a knowledge. Well, it's the same thing with a landscape. Understanding the landscape through an anatomical sensibility, how clouds form, will free you to be able to understand how to design a painting with clouds that make sense, that form at that time of day under those temperature situations. How a tree forms, how a tree grows, how they respect each other in the forest, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to get sunlight. So if they're in the forest, they're growing straight up. If they're out in the field, they're trying to get more light, so they're spreading out. Understanding that will help you to be able to create a poetic statement in almost like creating your own stage, because you have this anatomical understanding, which frees you to be able to make more emotional and poetic statements.
So that it can be learned.
Absolutely. Through hard work, yes, and perseverance.
So let's talk about the Hudson River School Fellowship. Tell me about the program, how you got involved, and what it means to you.
As they say, I'd rather be lucky than good. I got really lucky to get in the Hudson River Fellowship. There are far better painters than me that I think would have plugged in there perfectly.
What is it? Tell people what it is.
How I got into the Hudson River Fellowship, I like to say, was just divine intervention. Prior to my application, I came across an article in a magazine on Jacob Collins, and I was blown away by his work. And I think it was about a year later, I noticed a little ad for the Hudson River Fellowship, and I saw that his name was tied in with it. So I looked it up and was really intrigued by it. At that time, I was still only painting, 5 paintings a year, but I just started doing more drawing outside. Remember, I had not the best experience painting outside, so I felt one way to get outside and do some art making would be through drawing. So coincidentally, when I saw the advertisement for the Hudson River Fellowship, I put together an application and I sent it in, and I was real excited, and I got my rejection letter. We all get rejection letters, whether it's tangible or whether it's emotional. For me, it was just another fire under me. I said, I'm going to paint really hard for the next year, and I'm going to apply again. So I did that, and the stars aligned, and I got accepted. And when I got there, it was really very exciting for me. I knew I was going to be immersed in this culture of artists that were like-minded, that had amazing talent. And when I got there, I met 25 or so amazing painters that were still wonderful friends, but they all came from something I didn't have. They had training with ateliers, almost every one of them. I was the only self-taught artist there. And I'll never forget this. Jacob brought us all in the room the first night of the first fellowship, and to initiate dialogue and kind of introduce ourselves, he started projecting our application pictures. And I'm looking at the stuff that's up on the screen, I'm like, I'm not sure why I'm here right now. This is ridiculous. I was the last one to have my work projected. And people came up to me after and they said, oh, those are beautiful landscapes. And then it kind of clicked. I think I must have got in part because most of my work was embodied in the landscapes. Pretty much everything that I saw from the other students were these amazing figures and still lifes, and some drawings that were related to nature. I just felt very blessed to be in that setting. So I made a goal to myself. I said, I'm going to try to paint with a different person every day, and I'm going to pick their brains on technique, material, processes, and approaches. I walked out of the Hudson River experience my first year with a book full of notes, about 50 drawings, and about 40 field study paintings. That, for me, was my graduate degree in art training.
And how long was that process? How long was the fellowship?
The first year I was in it was 4 weeks. And one of the most special parts of it, not only was I immersed with these amazing artists and sitting up at night, just talking art and talking shop, that was amazing. But the other wonderful accent to the Hudson River Fellowship is they brought in professionals that were non-artists. They brought in art historians, physicists, botanists, geologists that would just talk about how the Catskills formed and walk us through the forest talking about the plants. Again, that anatomical knowledge was the graduate degree for understanding how to paint.
And so you did it for how long?
I was juried back into the fellowship for the next 2 years. And then my third year in the fellowship, Jacob said, let's go out and paint together today. So we hiked several miles up into the Catskill Mountains and we're overlooking the north-south lake region. And we're painting. He said, I've been wanting to ask you, we're thinking about taking the fellowship up to another level and starting to offer workshops in conjunction. And we were wondering if you'd be interested in teaching. So I'm kind of like pinching myself, trying to keep my cool. I said, absolutely, I'd be honored. And I've been teaching with the fellowship every year since. And it's wonderful because the workshops that are held in conjunction with the fellowship are open to anyone. So it's a chance for people to be immersed in the culture of the fellowship and be around that incredible energy, even if they didn't get juried in.
You know, I was not aware of that, Dan, because my assumption was you had to go for the full time and you had to be basically juried in.
Right, so the workshops, they're kind of like this parallel entity that are going on with the fellowship, but they're self-contained. And I might teach a 3-day workshop while the fellows are over here for the 4 weeks or the 3 weeks.
Right.
And there might be 3 or 4 other workshops that someone can go, I've got a week, so somebody can go there and paint for a week, or they can paint for 2 days. And they've got Eric Koppel and Ken Salaz and some of these other amazing painters that offer these workshops. And it's so wonderful because at night you may have 20 fellows that are getting together at some central location, and typically they'll invite all the workshop people to come and join. We'll just talk shop, and it's wonderful.
And you're developing such deep friendships, and you learn so much from those evenings together. As you may or may not know, I do an event in the Adirondacks every year, and I've done it for several years now.
And I will attend it one of these years.
Yeah, you're going to attend the next one, hopefully. The magic of being together, even if there's no workshop, quite frankly, the magic of being together with other painters, what we do is we all go paint together. We have two groups, Group A, Group B. We go out and paint together. Group A goes to one place. It's just because of the volume of people, because it's about 100 of us. And then every night, everybody brings in their catch for the day. I call it the catch for the day. And we lay out our paintings. And it's the best learning experience is to see how somebody else interpreted the same scene. And you'll see 50 paintings from approximately the same place, and none of them look alike. And some of the painters are beginners, and some of the painters are highly experienced. And nobody cares. It's just we're all out there together and we're learning from one another. And then we sit up at night and we just talk about art and the things that we've learned and what we learned today. And everybody just gets so much out of it. And I think we need more of that, and because that's where the magic really happens. That's, it's one thing to attend workshops, but a lot of workshops, they go during the day, then they go to their hotel room at night, and they're not interacting like they should. And I think that interaction really should be mandatory because it's really critical.
It's huge. Having a network of people beyond Facebook and social media where you can actually sit down with someone and enjoy a beverage and just talk, paints or the landscape or the still life or whatever, and just having that dialogue with like-minded people in any endeavor is so valuable. It's enriching. Regarding the Hudson River Fellowship, the one thing I think I walked away with that I felt was most important was the importance of drawing. My first week at the fellowship, you would have been embarrassed to bring out your paints. Everybody was out there drawing, and it's a way to acclimate into the setting of observation without having to deal with the complexities of color. And it really forces you to concentrate on one thing for a long time, whether it's a rock or a plant or a tree or more of a vista. And that was really, really important training, was that experience of just drawing. And we were out there virtually sun up to sundown 7 days a week, rain or shine. We put an umbrella up if it was raining. It was
Again, you would have been embarrassed to be sitting back in the lodge if it was raining. You're there for a reason, you make the most of the time. Then the second week, then you start transitioning into both open grisaille and closed grisaille. Grisaille is, the term is gray painting. Typically it's done with like a raw umber, that's probably the most common. And it's a monotone painting where you're starting to understand how to use paint. You're understanding how to interpret the landscape through values and not having to deal with the complexities of color. Your third or fourth week, then you start transitioning into full color paintings. And I found that a really effective way to do that is to not embark on a huge vista, which is dealing with everything from detail to space and pushing form. A better way to study the landscape, I think, is to do small still lifes that you find in the forest floor, and then work yourself up to a portrait of, say, a tree, and then work on what I would say is the macro, which is the vista. It's a much easier transition from going to painting, say, still lifes, which is very controlled, or even figure painting. When you go outside, you're dealing with all these variables of light, which is what most people complain about, wind, insects, temperature, you name it, it's all beating down on you and fighting you. And then if you combine that with something as complex as this incredible visual stimuli of a big vista, you're setting yourself up for a lot of frustration. So an easy transition would be to start with going into a forest, find a nice quiet place, and just find some really interesting objects on the ground and start there. Having gone through that experience of 4 weeks of drawing, painting outside every day, when I tried to paint from a photograph when I got home, I couldn't do it. I found myself having a really difficult time finding something valuable or informative through the photograph. I always found myself going back to my sketchbooks and really finding, trees or forms that made sense to me that I could include into a larger painting.
It's amazing how that happens. And I fought that for a lot of years. I still take a lot of photographs when I'm out, especially if I'm in places where I'm fleeting and I can't spend a lot of time. I can't sketch, but I don't use them. I tell myself I might use them, but I don't use them. And I've gotten to the point where I can only paint from my studies. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not a big sketchbook guy, and I need to become one. But because the studies don't lie, right. And I know that some painters actually try to match their studies exactly. For instance, Kevin McPherson will lay a piece of clear plastic over his painting, and he'll actually match the color first so that he gets it right when he's making a bigger painting. But, and the other thing that I have found fascinating, and I was glad to hear you say it, is the idea of the gray underpainting, the grisaille. Because, and now I have found, and I will learn what you're doing through this or through watching you, but I found that adds a lot of depth as an underpainting. It's first off, I think it's incredibly freeing for someone who's learning to paint to do value studies. Obviously, you have to kind of learn all the basics first, paint an egg or whatever, but to do value studies, because it's very freeing, because color is so overwhelming. And just to paint that, and then what's nice about that is that you can glaze right over it with thin paint and get this beautiful, rich, colorful seeming painting. So are you, when you do plein air studies, are you going direct paint, direct color mostly, or will you go out there and do a value study first, or what's your process?
In the field, I'm finding myself more and more these days still trying to capture the essence of the scene and trying to be fairly accurate with it, because I'm looking at that piece as a study that I may be able to use later in a painting. But at the same time, I try not to limit myself to that. I wouldn't actually put up a study right next to a work and try to match it necessarily exactly. I try to match maybe the relationships, but not necessarily the actual exact color. Because invariably I'm trying to capture what I remember or an emotion. And that's often not captured in this exact interpretation of the color or exact interpretation of the scene.
Well, plus you're trying to make a painting. Right. You're not necessarily trying to paint exactly. If you're you're combining. It sounds like you'll take pieces from one study and another and say, okay, I'm going to use this tree and this weed study and this mountain and this lake and you know, this sky, and put them all together into one big painting.
Yeah. Back to the photographs, I take a lot of photographs when I'm out there, and not that I'm using them so much as references. To me, they're more reminders. Where I saw something, I said, that's going to be a great painting. Maybe I don't have time to do the sketch on site. I may take a photograph just to remind myself that I was there, and then try to recollect that experience and then get it down through sketches. And in terms of sketches, I find that note-taking with your sketches is very helpful, at least for me it is. When I was in the fellowship, we used to make a ritual of going out and painting the sunset every night. And the magic happens in about 20 minutes. Well, if you paint it outside before, you know it usually takes a half an hour just to mix your paints. So one way of dealing with that, I found that I would do a sketch of the landmass, and I found that I could write notes a lot faster than I could paint. So on that drawing of the structure of the sunset, I would start taking very detailed notes, and the notes would be color relationships, like is a color warmer or cooler than what it's next to. I'd give a number to its value. I'd try to suggest its chroma or neutrality. And then what I found to be a really helpful exercise is to actually write down the colors I think I would need to make it. I found that those notes I've got up next to my studio paintings more than anything else. It helps me recollect how I would interpret that scene through pigments.
You know, some of the best artists I know, some of the best-selling artists I know, and not very many, but are following that exact same process. George Carlson, who is one of the top-selling, most in-demand artists, I think he probably does 6 paintings a year if he's lucky, and they sell for a couple $100,000. He has stopped doing plein air studies, gone out only doing sketches and associating numbers and using the same thing. And if you look back at the notes from some of the Hudson River School painters, a lot of those guys were doing that as well.
Yeah, it's a really effective way to get the information down quickly and very analytically too, because when you're painting in the landscape, it's a great experience once you get comfortable doing it. But a lot of times it's kind of intuitive, and you're mixing paints until it looks right, and then you put it on, but you may not remember how you made that color. But if you're sitting there writing down a description of what the colors you think you would need and its temperature and its value, it's much more ingrained into your consciousness.
So I'm curious, you know, most people don't know Jacob's landscape paintings, Jacob Collins. He's known more for his figure work, but his landscapes are beautiful, and the aesthetic is really special.
They're magical.
And I've noticed that the aesthetic of the Hudson River Fellowship people is also really wonderful. What, if anything, can you articulate that you learned from Jacob?
One of the wonderful aspects of the Hudson River Fellowship, when Jacob organized it, as I understand it, he was trying to make an extension of Grand Central Atelier, in that students would go out into nature and approach the landscape in a similar way that he approaches the still life and the figure, which is through a very analytical and anatomical approach, where you're truly trying to understand what you're seeing, which will help you interpret it visually. So it's this long-term, sustained study, as opposed to an alla prima, where you're trying to do a painting fairly quickly, as an impressionist may.
So for our viewers who might be early stage painters, or might even be a little further along, give me some advice that you could share with them in terms of some of the things they should be thinking about and doing right away.
The advice I would give to an aspiring artist who wants to learn how to paint the landscape outside is, one is to study from the past artist. Why reinvent the wheel? There's many artists of the past that have done this before and they've mastered it. Read their books, look at their artwork, and do master copies. Master copies will help you to do plein air work.
Do you do them out of the books, or do you do them on location at the museums?
I've never had the opportunity to do one in a museum, unfortunately. I have done them from books, but if you have a really good monitor, the quality of the high-resolution images from many of the museums now is almost as good as being there in person. You can't understand the sculptural quality of the paint, but you can really understand the color in that approach. That helps a lot. The other advice I would suggest to anybody who's developing their skills is to get out and paint a lot. Don't give up. You have to get a lot of miles under your belt. A lot of times when I'm doing a demonstration or I'm teaching, a student will say, I could never do that, or how did you do that so fast? What they're not seeing is the 50 discarded paintings that it took to be able to do that one. There's no shortcuts.
Got to practice.
You have to practice.
Yeah. Perfect practice. You know, just take one thing and do it till you get it right over and over again.
And follow your passion and enjoy the journey. There's going to be hiccups and there's going to be mistakes, and if you look at them in a positive light, they're going to help you.
So talk to me about the Niagara painting. You chose to use that as a instructional experience for people. And usually something instructional is relatively small and relatively simple, but you chose to take something that was a massive, very difficult subject. You used a large painting. The video is extremely thorough and long and really gets into it, and there's got to be 1,000 different lessons in it. Tell me why you chose to do this project and what this project means to you, and why it's important to put this all in an instructional setting.
Several years ago, I created an instructional video on plein air painting. And what I wanted to do with that was take the skills in the lessons I learned through my experiences in the Hudson River Fellowship and try to embody that in a short video on painting outside and some of the things that I think about when I'm painting outside. And it took me a little while to recover from making that video. And I felt that a seed was also planted on what's the next step. What do you do with these field studies once you start to understand the landscape? So it made sense. I said, all right, I'm going to want to do a studio painting and talk about how to use the field studies to create this. So it took me, ironically, close to a year to decide on what the subject would be. And then it just kind of hit me. I'm like, the Hudson River artists would often go to Niagara Falls, and it's less than an hour away. I'm not sure why I didn't think of this earlier. It made a lot of sense. And then, originally I was thinking maybe 18 by 24 or a 24 by 36 painting may make some sense. But I said, you know what, there's a lot of videos out there that show how to do a modest size studio painting. And I've never embarked on a really big painting. So I said, if it's going to be Niagara Falls, it would make some sense to make it a real big one. So it just kept growing and growing until it became 8 foot wide. And I'm very happy I did that because I learned a ton from doing this video. I learned about how to deal with a big canvas, how to make a frame from scratch, how to deal with composition on a larger scale, because a large scale painting, the composition needs to be approached very different than a small one. Because in many ways the person is engaged physically because they have to walk within the confines of the painting, as opposed to small painting where you're just experiencing it from one vantage. And one of the things as the painting was coming to completion, I was often having artists come over to critique it and get input, which I love doing. I always need that. And I found them interacting with the painting in ways I didn't foresee, which was this incredible dance of not only back and forth, but this dance of going back and front. And they were describing how they were experiencing the painting on an intimate scale when they're close, and then how different that felt when they got further away from it, which for me was a gift and very special.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a stunning painting. It's a monumental effort. And I think one thing that we need to remind artists about is that size does matter. Yeah. And what I mean by that, first off, we here at the Salmagundi Club, I've seen some unbelievably small masterpieces that, I'm out here photographing every painting because they're so wonderful. So size doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, you can make a masterpiece in any size. But the things that hang in museums, the things that you'll be remembered for when you're long gone, are likely to be the bigger paintings. Because most people aren't going to put them in the Salvation Army or throw them out. They're going to end up somewhere, and hopefully, you know, our careers go well enough that we'll be noted, and then the bigger, better paintings are going to end up in bigger, better collections, and then ultimately museums. And so I applaud you for that effort.
Thank you.
Because I don't think anybody really understands, or very few people understand, what a Herculean effort it is to create a big painting like that. And to do it, especially with the kind of sensitivities and detail that you've put into it. So congratulations on something that I think will be remembered for hundreds of years to come.
Thank you. I'm very excited to share it.
Right. Well, I've learned so much from you in this conversation today. Do you have any final thoughts for our viewers?
The only thing I think I would say is that don't be too hard on yourself. I teach a lot of workshops, and I think that I've seen many a wonderful painting abandoned too early, where the internal dialogue and those silent voices that get in every artist's head, don't listen to them.
So a good way to deal with that?
There's a lot of different ways. One is to get a support group. I find that if you have a solid foundation of good artist friends, they will help you through those difficult times.
Yeah. The other thing is take a walk.
Yeah. Walk away from it.
You know, we get so wrapped up in our paintings. Just take a walk. Get away from it for a half an hour. It doesn't matter. I mean, yes, the light's going to change. Everything's going to change. But sometimes you just have to separate yourself. And the same is true with the studio painting. And sometimes you just have to put it down, not deal with it for a couple of months, bring it back when you can get enthused about it again. You know, because if you've lost your passion, if you feel like it's drudgery when you're painting it, you shouldn't be painting it at that moment. You need to be excited about it and feel like, you know, you're making progress. And if you're not, put it away, and then it'll speak to you at another time.
And be willing to fail. Be willing to fail. Otherwise, you never give yourself the gift of the opportunity to succeed.
Well, it's been a pleasure getting to know you. Thank you for
It's wonderful to sit down with
taking
you.
the time and being in this historic place among your peers.
It's a pleasure.
Well, that was Thomas Kegler, and that video was recorded in the famous Salmagundi Club library. Had a lot of fun doing that. If you want to learn more about how to paint water, or how to paint landscapes, or how to paint waterfalls, or the entire Niagara Falls, the video is called Niagara, and you can find it at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, there's a special discount code in the comments section. Thank you for watching.
Niagara Falls. One of the great wonders of the world. In the 19th century, Niagara was the ultimate subject for Hudson River School painters like Frederick Church, Thomas Cole, Jasper Francis Cropsey, Sanford Robinson Gifford, and George Innes, who spent huge sums of time trying to conquer the falls in paint. For painters, Niagara is the most challenging subject to master in order to represent its power, its magnitude, its scale. Few artists have ever attempted the difficult task of mastering Niagara Falls since the 19th century, but one artist set out on a mission to master the falls in a monumental and historic painting. Thomas Kegler is a master painter whose style harkens back to this groundbreaking period in American art, and one of the major instructors in the world-renowned Hudson River Fellowship, which attracts the finest students in the world to study under Kegler. And in this all-new 8-hour instructional video, he takes you through his complete step-by-step studio painting process as he creates his awe-inspiring masterwork entitled Niagara Psalms 84:11. Combining vivid detail and a nuanced sense of expression, this 8-foot sweeping depiction of the most well-known waterfalls in the world will simply take your breath away. And Thomas will show you every technique he uses to create it. You'll discover how to create initial on-location sketches, including the critical points to consider in your initial notes and studies. You'll also discover Kegler's techniques for painting the sky, rainbow, various parts of different waterfalls, water flow at the bottom of the falls, the mist, cascades, rock cliff moss, plus several fascinating techniques for creating water and the falls, and much, much more. In Painting Niagara, Thomas Kegler shares his entire creation process, from the very first steps of creating the concept to adding the final details to your work, including frame design. If you've ever wanted to master waterfalls and painting water, join master artist Thomas Kegler and embark on your own exciting studio and plan your air painting experience today. Painting Niagara, a masterclass in studio painting, is now available on DVD and streaming video.